Sarah had always been an easygoing flight attendant who enjoyed her job. She loved meeting new people, hearing their stories, and even when things got hectic, she could handle it with a smile. But today, something felt different. From the moment she stepped onto the plane, the air was thick with anticipation, and she couldn't quite figure out why. As she passed down the aisle, setting up her cart and greeting the passengers, she noticed him, the man sitting in the business class seat. He wasn't like the others who were engrossed in their phones or chatting away. He sat straight up, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something or someone. His face was stern, his jaw set in a way that made Sarah uneasy. It wasn't just his posture or his silence, but the way his presence seemed to make the entire cabin feel smaller. She tried to push the thought out of her mind as she continued her duties, but he lingered in the back of her mind. With every turn she made down the aisle, she caught glimpses of him, watching her, his eyes following her every move with a cold intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just the stare that unsettled her. It was the way he didn't seem to be bothered by anything, as if he were completely unaffected by the noise of the busy cabin around him, the chatter of children, the clinking of trays, the hum of the airplane engines. All seemed to fade into the background when his gaze was fixed on her. He wasn't the type to make small talk or ask for anything in a polite manner. When she walked by him, offering her usual polite greeting, he simply nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers for a moment longer than necessary. Sarah felt her stomach turn a little, but she brushed it off, chalking it up to her nerves for the day. After all, it had been a long shift, and the plane was full. She could handle this, no problem. She moved on with her work, moving through the aisles as she offered drinks and snacks to the passengers. But every time she passed him, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was almost as if he were studying her, watching her movements, analyzing her with every step. She thought it was strange, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had a job to do, and she needed to focus. As the flight continued, she checked on her passengers, making sure everyone was comfortable. When she returned to the business class section to do her rounds, she noticed the man had shifted slightly. His eyes were still locked on her, but now there was a new edge to his gaze, something colder, something harder. It made her pause for a moment, and her heart skipped a beat. She straightened up and continued with her work, trying not to let it show. But inside, she could feel her nerves begin to tighten. She moved down the aisle as she handed out beverages and checked on the other passengers. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this man. He wasn't asking for anything, but he was watching her every move, like he was waiting for something, or maybe even expecting her to do something wrong. And that's when it happened. She was moving down the aisle again when he called out her name, softly at first, but loud enough for her to hear. She stopped and turned to look at him. His eyes were still fixed on her, as if they never left her the whole time. He said one simple thing, just a question that made her blood run cold. "Do you know who I am?" Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the words echoed in her mind. His eyes were cold, but there was something behind them, something that made her want to step back. But she stood her ground, forcing herself to keep her composure. She smiled the way she always did when she was caught off guard, but the smile felt stiff, like she was wearing a mask that couldn't hide her growing discomfort. She tried to shake it off, but the question lingered in the air. "Do you know who I am?" She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, like the walls of the cabin were closing in on her. She wasn't sure why, but it felt like a challenge. It was as if his gaze was daring her to answer, and she wasn't sure how to respond. For a moment she wondered if she should just keep walking, pretend she didn't hear him. But something about the way he asked the question made it impossible to ignore. It felt like he wasn't just asking out of curiosity, like he was testing her. Her mind raced as she searched for the right words to say, but they wouldn't come. She opened her mouth, but the only sound that escaped was a nervous laugh. She quickly cleared her throat and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think I know you. No offense," she added, trying to keep her voice light, trying to brush off the strange tension between them. But when he didn't respond, she felt an uneasy chill creep up her spine. He just kept staring at her, the silence between them thickening until it felt unbearable. She shifted from foot to foot and forced herself to look away, but his presence was so overwhelming it felt like the entire plane was watching them. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. She wanted to move on, but something inside her told her to stay. The general didn't speak for what seemed like an eternity, and just when Sarah thought she might be able to leave, his eyes narrowed slightly, and he tilted his head as if assessing her. "You should know better than to ask me that question," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet power behind it. Sarah's heart skipped again. She tried to laugh it off, but it didn't sound convincing to her own ears. His words hung in the air. Like a warning, she felt her palms grow sweaty, and for the first time in her career she questioned herself. This wasn't just any passenger she had encountered. This was different. This wasn't just a rude traveler. This was something else altogether. The way he carried himself, the way he looked at her, it wasn't just arrogance. It was as if he knew something she didn't, something that made her feel small. But she wasn't going to let it show. She wasn't going to let him see that she was intimidated. She forced herself to speak again. "I'm sorry if I offended you, sir. I'm just doing my job. If there's anything you need, I'll be happy to help." She tried to keep the words polite, but she couldn't mask the tension in her voice. She was now on edge, and she could feel that something was off. He didn't respond to her apology. Instead, he simply stood up, his movement slow and deliberate. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as he rose to his full height, his frame towering over her. And though he didn't raise his voice, there was an undeniable presence to him that made her feel like she was standing in the shadow of something far larger than her. She backed up a step instinctively, but her legs felt heavy, like they were stuck to the ground. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out, her mouth dry. She felt her throat tighten, and the back of her mind screamed at her to just walk away. But she couldn't move. Her feet were frozen in place. The general didn't seem to care about her reaction. Instead, he reached for the overhead compartment and began adjusting something in his seat. His actions were calm, almost methodical, as if he were in complete control of the situation. But something about it made Sarah's skin crawl. His indifference only made the situation feel more tense, because it was clear he didn't think much of her or her role in this interaction. He was someone who didn't need to make a scene, but the power was there, the authority. It was in every gesture, every subtle shift of his posture. And Sarah realized then, with a creeping dread, that he wasn't just any man on this flight. He was someone who had seen things, done things that most people could only imagine. And in that moment, she understood the weight of his question. She had just crossed a line she wasn't sure she could come back from. Sarah stood there, her body frozen in place, as the general continued his movements around the seat. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. It was as if she was invisible to him. And yet she could feel his eyes still on her. Even though they weren't looking directly at her, there was an oppressive weight in the air that pressed down on her chest. She forced herself to take a deep breath, but it didn't calm her. The words he'd spoken to her earlier echoed in her mind. "You should know better than to ask me that question." The chill in his voice sent another wave of discomfort over her, and it was as if the air around her had thickened with every second. She stood there unsure of what to do. Her thoughts were racing, but they couldn't keep up with the panic that was starting to set in. She was the one in control here, wasn't she? She was the flight attendant. She was supposed to make sure the passengers were comfortable. But the longer she stayed near this man, the more she realized how out of place. She felt how small. She felt how utterly powerless. She had no idea who he was, why he was like this, or what he even wanted. But there was something in his calmness, something in the way he handled everything that made her realize he wasn't just any ordinary person on this flight. Sarah forced her hands to stop shaking and straightened her posture. No, she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She wouldn't let him control the situation. No matter how much he tried to make her feel small, she would do her job. She would do it well. because that's what she always did. The flight continued around her as the hum of the engines filled the silence that hung between them. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everyone on this plane could feel it too, the tension in the air, the growing unease that seemed to permeate the cabin. It was almost as if everyone was silently aware that something was off, though no one dared to speak of it. She glanced around the cabin and noticed a few passengers looking over at her, some with curiosity, some with concern. The whispers had started. She could feel them. Even though she couldn't hear them, their eyes were watching her and the general. And though they pretended not to notice, there was a sense of unease spreading through the plane like a ripple on water. But no one dared to speak out loud. No one dared to break the silence, not even the other flight attendants who were busy with their own duties. But Sarah could feel the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. As the minutes passed, she quickly moved away from the general, walking briskly down the aisle, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she passed the curtain and entered the galley, she didn't feel any safer. In fact, the silence of the back of the plane made her feel even more vulnerable. It was then that one of the other flight attendants approached her, a tall woman named Kelly, who had been working at the airline for years. She was known for her calm demeanor and her ability to handle any situation without batting an eye. Kelly was one of the few people who could stay composed in the most stressful moments. But today, her face looked different. Her usual calm was replaced with something more serious, more wary. Sarah could see it immediately. "What's going on, Sarah?" Kelly asked quietly, leaning in close so the other passengers wouldn't overhear. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She felt as though she had been holding her breath for too long, and now that she had the chance to speak, it was as if her throat was constricting. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice, but all she could manage was a shaky, "I don't know, he's different. I don't know who he is, but he's not like any passenger I've ever dealt with." Kelly's gaze flickered toward the front of the cabin, where the general was sitting still, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. Sarah could see the concern in Kelly's eyes, but it was quickly masked by a professional smile. She gave a small nod and said, "Just take it easy with him, okay? He's not someone you want to mess with." Sarah didn't understand what she meant, not at first. But then Kelly's words began to sink in, and something cold twisted in Sarah's stomach. She knew she wasn't just dealing with a difficult passenger. Now she was dealing with someone dangerous, someone who could easily shatter the calm of this entire flight. But she didn't know how dangerous yet. And that thought was even more terrifying than anything she had felt so far. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had taken hold of her as she moved through the galley. Her heart still pounding from the brief exchange with Kelly, her mind raced with thoughts of the man in business class and the eerie calmness he carried with him. She glanced back toward the front of the plane, but the general was still there, sitting motionless, his face hard like a stone. She felt her stomach turn again and wondered if she should have just ignored him, kept her distance. But now it felt too late to back away. She had already crossed some kind of line with him, and she didn't know how far that line went. Sarah's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding as she tried to focus on her tasks. But the images of his cold eyes and his unsettling words kept flashing in her mind. She had to do something about this. The flight wasn't even halfway through, and she couldn't bear the thought of spending the next few hours feeling like she was walking on eggshells. But what could she do? She didn't have the authority to confront him directly again. She wasn't supposed to be dealing with passengers on this level. This was supposed to be a simple flight, nothing out of the ordinary. She wasn't prepared for whatever this was. As the hours passed and the meal service came to an end, Sarah couldn't shake the growing sense that she was being watched. She would glance up and catch the general's eyes just for a second before he looked away or turned his attention elsewhere, but it was enough to make her skin crawl. It was like he was tracking her every move, studying her every action, waiting for her to make another mistake. She began to move more quickly through the aisles, trying to keep herself busy avoiding eye contact with him. But it didn't help. It only made the tension worse each time she passed by him. It felt like he was getting closer and closer to something that was just out of her reach. She couldn't let it go. She had to confront him again, had to figure out what he wanted from her. But the fear was holding her back. It wasn't just the fear of him, it was the fear of what he might do if she crossed him again. She wasn't used to being afraid of anyone. She had dealt with her share of difficult passengers before. But none of them had made her feel like this. None of them had made her question herself. She thought about what Kelly had said, take it easy with him, okay. He's not someone you want to mess with, the words echoed in her mind. And she knew that Kelly wasn't just talking about someone who was rude or demanding. There was something darker in Kelly's tone, something that Sarah hadn't understood at the time. But now it was becoming clear the general was someone who could ruin her entire career with a single word. And she had already made an enemy of him. She felt a sudden wave of nausea as she realized just how much trouble she might be in. She wanted to turn back, go to the captain, tell him what had happened. But she didn't know how to explain it. What could she say? There was nothing specific, just a feeling that gnawed at her, a sense that this man wasn't like the others. He had power. Behind him, power, but Sarah couldn't even comprehend. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. And she couldn't breathe. She tried to focus on her duties, keep her mind on the passengers who needed her, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of the general's presence. It was like a shadow following her. Wherever she went, his cold stare seeping into her thoughts. No matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, and Sarah felt herself starting to crack. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She had to face this. But how could she? She wasn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized she was completely out of her depth. It was then that a voice behind her made her jump. Sarah turned to see one of the other flight attendants, a man named Mark, who had worked with her for a long time. His face was drawn tight with concern. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "Sarah, you need to go to the back now," he said, his tone urgent. She didn't ask why. She just nodded and followed him quickly through the galley towards the rear of the plane. The further they moved from the business class section, the more she felt like she could breathe again. But something told her that she wasn't out of danger, yet something told her the worst was still coming. Sarah followed Mark to the back of the plane, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. As they walked quickly through the narrow aisles, the hum of the engines felt deafening now, a constant reminder of the tension hanging in the air. Mark didn't say a word, but his quick pace and tight expression told Sarah all she needed to know. Something was wrong, something had shifted, and she was caught in the middle of it. She couldn't shake the image of the general's cold eyes, his presence so strong it had felt like the whole plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what was it? What was he planning? She thought back to the moment when she had first noticed him in business class, how he had barely acknowledged her presence, how everything about him had seemed so cold and distant. But now that same coldness was closing in on her like a vice. She didn't know how long it would take before she cracked under the pressure. Sarah had seen her share of tough passengers before, but none had ever made her feel so powerless, so exposed. She had dealt with rude, demanding customers. But this felt different. It wasn't about the little things anymore. It was about something much deeper, a kind of control that she didn't understand, and maybe didn't even want to understand. But she was trapped in it now, trapped with no easy way out. When they reached the rear galley, Mark motioned for her to step inside. He closed the door behind them. And for a moment Sarah felt like she could finally breathe. The noise of the plane was muffled in the back, and the chaos of the front cabin felt far away. She tried to calm herself, but the anxiety wouldn't go away, the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. Sarah turned to Mark, her voice shaky. "What's going on, Mark? What do you know?" His eyes flickered toward the door, like he was checking to make sure. No one was listening then. He stepped closer, his voice low and serious. "You've made a mistake, Sarah," he said quietly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." She felt a chill run down her spine As the words sank in, "What do you mean, who is he?" she asked the words, almost stuck in her throat. She had already guessed it wasn't just some regular passenger. But hearing Mark say it out loud made it real. Mark glanced around again, making sure no one else was around before speaking again slowly. "It's General David Reynolds," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's a retired 4-star general, one of the most decorated men in the country. I don't know all the details, but I've heard enough to know that you don't mess with him." Sarah's stomach dropped. She had heard the name before, in passing on the news or in the papers, but she had never really thought much about it. How could she have known that this was the same man sitting just a few rows ahead of her? She felt her knees weaken as the weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a grumpy old man. This was someone who had the power to make or break lives just with a word, and she had already made him angry. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was just a misunderstanding. I was trying to do my job." Mark's expression softened just a little, but it didn't reach his eyes. He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand," he said. "You can't just apologize to him and expect it to go away, Sarah. I don't know what he's capable of, but I do know you're in deeper than you think." She felt her breath catch in her throat. The room seemed to spin as the implications of Mark's words hit her full force. She had no idea what she had walked into. She had no idea how dangerous this situation was, and now it was too late to walk away. She felt a knot tighten in her chest, and for a moment she thought she might actually be sick. She took a step back against the galley counter, trying to steady herself. But her thoughts were all over the place. She needed a plan. She needed something to hold on to. But nothing came to her mind. It felt like the walls were closing in again, like that oppressive weight was returning. And this time there was no escaping it. She had to face whatever was coming. But how could she, when she didn't even know what she was up against? Mark gave her a long look, as if weighing his next words. "Carefully listen to me, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You need to keep your distance from him the rest of the flight. Don't make any more contact. Do your job. Keep everything strictly professional. If he says anything else to you, don't engage. Just walk away, understand?" Sarah nodded numbly. She couldn't find the words to respond. Her mind was racing too fast. She didn't know if she could follow his advice, if she could keep calm enough to avoid the general for the rest of the flight. But she didn't have much of a choice. She had no idea what the consequences would be if she failed to listen to Mark's warning, but she wasn't willing to find out. Sarah stood there, her mind swirling with Mark's words. General David Reynolds, one of the most powerful men in the country, and she had somehow managed to provoke him. She felt her pulse quicken as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. How could she have been so careless? How could she have not recognized him earlier? It wasn't just his rank that terrified her, but the sheer power that came with it, the connections, the influence. She didn't know how deep his reach went, but she knew it was far enough to ruin her life if he wanted to. Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to regain some control of her emotions. But the panic was still there, gnawing at her insides. She needed to calm down. She needed to focus. But the thought of facing him again made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and she'd fall into a world she couldn't escape from. Her thoughts were racing. She had to find a way to fix this, to make it right. But how Mark's warning echoed in her mind. Keep your distance, don't engage, just walk away. She knew he was right. But could she really do that? Could she just pretend nothing was wrong and go back to her duties like everything was normal? What if he confronted her again? What if he decided to make an example of her? Sarah's hands were trembling now, and she wiped them quickly on her uniform, trying to hide the nervousness that was threatening to spill over. She glanced at the door to the galley, then back at Mark. His face was grim, but there was something else there, a hint of pity, maybe even fear. It made her stomach turn. She couldn't afford to be weak. She couldn't let him see how scared she was, but deep down she knew the truth. She was terrified. She had no idea what kind of man General Reynolds really was, but she was starting to get a sense of it now. And it wasn't a comforting thought. She knew she couldn't let him break her, but at the same time, she didn't know how far he would go to make sure she stayed in line. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it together with every passing second. She felt the walls of the plane closing in tighter and tighter, like a trap that was slowly tightening around her. She was suffocating. She needed space to think. But there was no escape. Not now. She had to face whatever was coming next. She forced herself to move. She couldn't stay in the galley forever. She had a job to do, and no matter how much fear twisted in her chest, she couldn't let it stop her. She couldn't let him win. She had to keep her head down, do her job, and pray that the flight would end without incident. She knew it wasn't going to be that easy. As she stepped out of the galley and moved toward the front of the plane, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. She didn't know if they had noticed the tension between her and the general, but it felt like everyone was watching her. As she passed by them, she kept her gaze forward, trying not to acknowledge anyone. She didn't want to make eye contact. She didn't want to see the questions or the curiosity in their eyes. She just wanted to make it through the flight without any more trouble. But as she reached business class, her heart skipped a beat, because there he was, General Reynolds, still sitting in his seat. But this time his eyes were on her. The coldness was gone, replaced with something even more unnerving. It was almost like amusement, like he knew something she didn't like. He was watching her struggle with a quiet satisfaction. Her breath caught in her throat for a moment, and she had to force herself to keep moving. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. She focused on the aisle as she walked past his seat. And that's when he spoke her name again. This time it wasn't a question. It wasn't even a demand. It was a statement. Sarah. She heard it clearly, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. The sound of her name sent a shiver down her spine, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. She didn't turn to face him, but she could feel his eyes on her, as if they were burning into her back. She tried to ignore it, but his voice came again, softer this time, more insistent. "You're avoiding me, Sarah," he said, his tone almost too calm, too controlled. The way he said her name made her stomach twist in knots. She couldn't tell if he was playing a game with her, or if he was just testing how far he could push her before she broke. But either way, she knew she had no choice now. She had to face him head on and somehow survive it. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as his voice pierced the air again, his calm tone somehow making the situation worse than it already was. "You're avoiding me, Sarah." She heard his words clear and sharp, but they felt like they were coming from a distance, yet they seemed to echo in her mind. She didn't turn to face him. Not right away. Her legs felt like they were made of lead as she forced herself to keep walking, each step taking her further into the tension. She could feel his gaze on her back, following her as she moved past him. It felt suffocating. It felt like she was trapped in a cage with no way out. His voice was softer now, but still too controlled, still too knowing. "Sarah." His words lingered in the air, and she could feel the weight of them pressing against her skin. Her breathing quickened, but she kept her focus forward. She couldn't show any weakness, couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her panic. Not again. His words didn't stop. They kept coming, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the air with razor precision. "You're scared, aren't you?" She wanted to deny it, wanted to turn around and tell him she wasn't afraid, but she couldn't bring herself to speak the words. She couldn't lie to him, because she was scared in a way she had never been before. She had dealt with unruly passengers. She had dealt with difficult situations, but none of them had made her feel this small. None of them had made her feel like she was walking on the edge of a knife. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was keep moving forward like a puppet with invisible strings, pulling her along. "You know who I am, don't you?" he said, now his voice laced with amusement and something darker. Sarah felt a cold chill spread through her body as his words sank in. How did he know? How much had he figured out? She was sure she hadn't said anything, but the way he spoke, the way he seemed to be reading her every thought, made her realize how little control she had over the situation. She knew she had to keep her distance, like Mark had said, But now it felt impossible. How could she ignore him? How could she pretend nothing was wrong when he was so close, when he could ruin her life? With just a word she could feel her throat tighten as his presence seemed to grow stronger. He wasn't just some retired general. He wasn't just an old man traveling on a plane. He was someone who had lived through things she could never imagine. And that kind of person didn't let go easily. He wasn't going to just forget what had happened. He wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences. She needed to do something. But she didn't know what. Every time she tried to think clearly, all that came to mind was his voice, his eyes, the way he seemed to see right through her, every part of her, every weakness. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, the sinking sensation in her stomach, as the reality of what was happening set in. She had no idea what he wanted, but the way he had spoken to her, the way he had trapped her in this conversation, made her realize that whatever it wasn't going to end well. She had to act fast. She couldn't let him control her like this. She had to take control back. Somehow she forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat and took another step forward, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to follow her no matter where she went. But then the general's voice stopped her once again. "Sarah, I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his tone shifting just slightly. It was almost too calm, too reassuring, as if he were trying to lull her into some false sense of safety. But Sarah wasn't fooled. There was something in his voice, something that told her he was lying, or at the very least hiding the truth from her. She stopped walking, but didn't turn around, and she wasn't ready to face him. "Yet, what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like they were stuck in her throat. But she couldn't keep them in any longer. She needed to know, she needed to understand why he was doing this, why he had singled her out. She could hear him shift in his seat, the sound of fabric rustling. And then his voice came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "I'm just making sure you understand your place." He said the words so simple yet so chilling. And Sarah felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. She understood exactly what he meant now. He wasn't just a retired general. He wasn't just a man with power and influence. He was someone who expected obedience, someone who would not let her off easily, no matter how much she tried to run from it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. "You understand your place." It felt like the air in the cabin thickened around her, like she couldn't get enough oxygen. Her mind was spinning as she tried to make sense of what he meant. Was he threatening her? Or was it something else? Was she trapped in some kind of game where the rules kept shifting and she couldn't keep up? She tried to push past the panic rising in her chest, but it was hard to focus. All she could hear was the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. Every second felt like a lifetime. Every step closer to him felt like it was leading her deeper into something she couldn't escape from. She kept her back turned to him. As she tried to gather her thoughts, she had to figure out what to do, but all she could think about was that cold stare from earlier, the way he had watched her every move, and how every word he spoke seemed to cut through her like a blade. She wanted to turn around, face him head on, but she was frozen, like something was holding her in place, like a predator waiting to strike. Just a moment's hesitation, and she'd be done for. But Sarah had one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't let him control her. She couldn't let him win. She had to fight back somehow. But how, when every part of her was screaming to run? She closed her eyes for a second, her fingers tightening around the cart. She was still pushing down the aisle. As she tried to steady herself, she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. But she refused to show him how much he affected her. She wasn't going to break. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She had worked too hard for this job, for everything to fall apart. Because of a man like him, she straightened her back and forced herself to keep walking down the aisle. The sound of the other passengers murmuring was louder now, the tension in the air more palpable. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her movements deliberate. She didn't dare look back. She wasn't going to show him she was afraid. She just needed to make it to the galley, to safety. But as she reached the end of the aisle, she heard it again. "Sarah, don't walk away from me," he said this time, his voice low, but firm it felt like an order, not a request. She could almost feel the weight of his presence, looming over her like a storm waiting to break. She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. She just kept moving forward. But with every step, it felt like she was moving further into his trap, further into his web of control. "Sarah, you're not getting away that easily." His words stopped her in her tracks. And for a moment she felt paralyzed, like her feet were glued to the floor. She didn't turn to face him. But she knew he was watching her. She could feel it deep in her bones. She couldn't let him intimidate her. She couldn't let him see her fear. She wasn't that person. She wasn't going to cower in front of him. But the truth was, she didn't know how to escape this. She didn't know how to get out of the situation. She had found herself, and her hands shook as she tightened her grip on the cart. She had to get back to the galley. She had to find a way out. But she couldn't do it on her own. Mark had warned her earlier. But was it too late to heed that warning? Was it too late to keep her distance? She thought of the general's words, "You understand your place." Sarah had never felt more trapped in her life. She could hear the quiet murmur of the other passengers around her, but they all felt like shadows. Now the walls of the plane closing in. She wasn't sure who she could trust. She wasn't sure what was real anymore. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she knew she couldn't. She had no choice but to face him at some point. But what would that look like? What would he do? When she finally turned around to face him, Sarah could feel the knot in her stomach tighten with each passing second. She could hear her own breath, now ragged and shallow. She didn't know what was coming, but she could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. She had no idea what he would say next, what he wanted from her. But she knew one thing for certain: it wasn't going to be easy. And whatever happened next was going to change everything.